Boundary building is an experimental process by its very nature. If you knew what your boundaries were, you'd know what your boundaries are. So you have to experiment with them as you're building them. I would try to say things one way, and if it didn't work out, then I would tweak it and see what actually worked. Now, setting boundaries is hard enough without clear communication. When we're murky or indirect, we risk sending mixed signals or creating unnecessary conflict, making it harder to protect our needs. Hi, I'm Barb Nangle. I want to welcome you to my podcast, Fragmented to Whole Life Lessons from 12-Step Recovery, where I help people heal their emotional, psychological, and spiritual wounds and make deep, lasting changes in their lives. I'm a boundaries coach who specializes in helping women who say yes when they really want to say no, and who neglect themselves because they're so focused on others. I've coached hundreds of people to create boundaries by design, a blueprint for life. I have a free boundary building starter kit at boundariesstarterkit.com. On this podcast, I share my experience, strength, and hope from recovery. I don't support or endorse any particular 12-step recovery fellowship, and I don't claim to speak for any 12-step fellowship. I don't believe that 12-step recovery is the only way to recover. You might need additional help. I'm an avid beachcomber and a formerly closeted fan of the Hallmark Channel, especially the Christmas movies. I wear fingerless gloves almost all year round because my hands are always cold, and I love taking pictures of license plates with my initials BN on them. My hope is that you'll find my words concretely helpful in improving your life, whether you're in recovery or not. If you like what you've heard on this episode, please screenshot it and share it on your social media. Be sure to tag me at Higher Power Coaching. This is episode 294, How to Master Communication, Avoid Conflict, and Create Healthier Relationships. In this episode, I'll share how I went from thinking I was a great communicator to learning I had a lot to improve on, especially when it came to personal relationships. I'll also give you practical tips on how to communicate more effectively, especially when setting boundaries. Before I got into recovery, I thought that I was a good communicator. At the time, I was a program coordinator for urban education, prevention, and policy research at Yale University, and I was running programs in schools, sometimes up to 25 schools at a time. And I was able to keep the information flowing back and forth between all the parties involved. So I thought, oh yeah, I'm a great communicator. And that may have been so when it came to communicating about the work. But interpersonally, I came to realize I was a horrible communicator. And when I look back now at all of my personal relationships, especially romantic, I was a shitty communicator. When I say that, I mean I did things like communicate indirectly, which means both talking to people who were not involved in a situation, as well as hinting at and beating around the bush about things rather than coming right out and saying what I meant. I also expected people should know things because I decided they should know. And the reality is, if someone should know something, then they would know it. And if they don't seem to know, then you come right out and tell them, even if you've told them 59 times before. Everybody thinks differently and retains different things. I also expected people to read my mind, even though when people would say, I'm not reading your mind, I don't know how to do that, I would say, I don't expect you to. But when I got in recovery and I looked back at my behavior, I was like, no, I really wanted them to read my mind. And if I didn't get what someone was saying or what they meant, instead of clarifying by asking questions, I would fill in the gaps by trying to read their minds. And usually when I did that, it came out negative, like they were doing something to me and I was somehow being victimized by them in that situation. And I really learned to communicate effectively in recovery, and especially when I was learning how to build healthy boundaries. And that's because I had to experiment when setting my boundaries. Boundary building is an experimental process by its very nature. If you knew what your boundaries were, you'd know what your boundaries are. So you have to experiment with them as you're building them. I would try to say things one way, and if it didn't work out, then I would tweak it and see what actually worked. Now, setting boundaries is hard enough without clear communication. When we're murky or indirect, we risk sending mixed signals or creating unnecessary conflict, making it harder to protect our needs. So I'll give you examples of what the experimental process looked like for me with my food program. I'm in recovery for compulsive overeating and sugar addiction. And when I first started that recovery program, I would tell people I don't eat sugar. And then I would basically turn into a research project for them. They'd be like, oh, do you eat fruit? What about this? What about that? And I realized this is way too uncomfortable for me. I do not want to be answering questions like that. I don't want to go into this level of detail. So then I started saying, I don't eat sweets. And people were like, oh my God, I wish I couldn't eat sweets. How do you do it? And I would say, well, I'm in recovery for compulsive overeating and sugar addiction. They'd say like, oh yeah, I'm addicted to sugar too. And I'd say, no, I'm literally addicted to sugar. I'm in an addiction program and treating it like an addiction through this recovery program. And eventually I realized this is still too much detail. I don't want to go into that level of detail. So I decided to give even less information to less people. So I decided to only share when it was absolutely relevant. For example, if I was going to their house for a meal or going out to eat with them. And I finally landed on saying, I have food issues. Interestingly, nobody quizzes me when I say I have food issues. And I think that's because nowadays people are vegan, lactose intolerant, have celiac disease, they eat paleo or whatever. So people don't seem to ask me questions when I give less info and only when absolutely necessary. So I'm setting boundaries with myself by sharing only so much info while at the same time setting boundaries around my food. Now, I had to experiment with how I communicate and what I communicate and with who. It's actually only relevant in very few circumstances. Like if I bring my own food somewhere, people might say, oh, we have plenty of food. And I just say things like, I have food issues. So those are some examples of how I learned to communicate my boundaries by experimenting and tweaking what I was saying over time. I got to determine what was right for me based on what felt right to me. This taught me that learning to communicate is a process. It's okay to test different ways of expressing yourself until you find what works for you. Now I'm going to give you some tips that I've learned for how to communicate effectively, and I cannot stress enough the importance of this. Use I statements. You may have heard this before, and that's because it's imperative. Using I statements means talking from your own perspective and using the word I when you begin. I teach this to my private clients because most of my clients, really all of my clients come to me completely focused on other people and everything outside themselves and not focused on themselves. Using I language is an easy and wonderful way to keep the focus on yourself. So here are the examples I use with my clients. The first example, instead of saying something like, you never listen, the I statement would be, I don't feel heard. Now, the reason we want to use I statements is because when we're talking about ourselves, it's very difficult for people to dispute what's the truth about you. Whereas if you're talking about them and saying something like, you never listen, they're likely to go on the defensive, which means conflict. In this particular example, you'd likely end up talking about whether or not they ever listen and not about the actual issue, which is, I don't feel heard. If you say you never listen, they're probably going to get defensive because you're talking about them, not you. And they're the expert on themselves, just like you're the expert on you. And when you add words like never, it's even more likely they're going to go on the defensive, which means there's going to be a conflict. And that is not how you have a healthy relationship. Instead, if you kept the focus on yourself and used I language and said, I don't feel heard, it's pretty hard for them to dispute whether or not you feel heard. And there's nothing for them to defend. You've gotten to the actual issue, which is not feeling heard. If you say you never listen, they're probably going to start arguing with you about all the times when they actually have listened. And the topic of conversation is going to be how true or not true that is, as opposed to the real issue of you not feeling heard. You are infinitely more likely to have actual communication with the person when you use I language and say something like, I don't feel heard. And you're so much more likely to avoid conflict when you use I language. Here's another example. Let's say you're going out to eat with someone that you've gone out to eat with many times, and they suggest Thai food. Instead of saying something like, you know, I hate Thai food, you could say, I prefer Caribbean cuisine. If you say, you know, I hate Thai food, you've started with you, which means they're likely to go on the defensive. And then when you throw in an inflammatory word like hate, they're even more likely to be defensive and conflict has started. So they might say things like, I can't keep track of what you like and don't like. It's not my job. So the conversation will be about what they do and do not know about you. Whereas if you use I language and focus on what you do want rather than what you don't want, you're much more likely to have actual communication with that person and avoid conflict. Now, that doesn't mean if you say, I prefer Caribbean cuisine, they're automatically going to be like, oh, okay, let's have Caribbean, unless they really like Caribbean cuisine. But you're much more likely to come to a compromise and try something completely different if they don't like Caribbean. Here's another example of something I absolutely would have done in the past. Let's say you go to an event with someone and you want to go home early. You might say to them, don't you want to go home early? Trying to manipulate them into thinking it's their idea. I totally did that kind of thing in the past. The best way to handle something like that is to use I language to keep the focus on you and what you actually want. That would sound something like, I'd like to go home. When you put the focus on them and they don't want to go home early, you've avoided the actual issue, which is that you would like to go home. And if they're not ready to leave, you might get into a conflict because they're not ready to go home and might feel manipulated by you asking it in that way. But if you say, I'd like to go home and they don't want to go home, you've avoided conflict and can have an actual conversation with them. Perhaps one of you will take a taxi and the other will keep the car. The result is that you can actually get your needs met, which is what we're trying to communicate for in the first place. This is another reason why keeping the focus on yourself and using I language is really important. You're much more likely to get your needs met by stating what you want. It's not up to other people to meet your needs. It's up to you, but they might assist you. But it's hard to make that happen when you don't clearly communicate what that is. They can't do that if you're not being clear with them about what the actual issue is. Before recovery, I avoided direct communication. To be honest with you, I thought that it was rude, which it's not. Being clear is kind. And I relied on passive strategies like hinting, beating around the bush, etc. Now I approach situations with clarity and confidence. And by the way, having clarity gives confidence. And that means I know how to express myself in ways that invite genuine dialogue rather than conflict. So if you want to have healthier relationships, we want to avoid conflict by inviting genuine dialogue. So to recap, here are the key lessons. Use I statements to keep the focus on yourself and avoid defensiveness. Be clear and direct about your needs rather than hinting or expect people should know things. Treat communication as a skill that can be developed and improved. You experiment, reflect, and adjust as needed. Effective communication is foundational for setting boundaries and especially for building healthier relationships. What I've found is that professional women are afraid people won't like them, so they don't say no. Then they become overwhelmed and resentful because they keep giving in to others and take on too much. What they really want is to have balanced relationships where there's give and take without having to have a confrontation. But they think the problem is that if they knew just the right words to say, things would go more smoothly and they'd be able to stick to their boundaries. So they end up letting people walk all over them and then explode when they can't take it anymore. But the real problem is that they don't know what's okay with them and not okay with them because they're so focused on others. That means they don't set limits or ask for help. What they need to do is focus internally to get clear on what matters to them so they know what to say no to and can communicate that clearly with calm confidence. If this sounds like you, we should talk. Go to barbchat.net to sign up for a call with me. If you like this podcast, and I'm guessing you did because you're still listening, you will also love my weekly newsletter, Friday Fragments, which has short essays similar to the podcast. You can check it out at fridayfragments.news. That's fridayfragments.news. If you haven't already subscribed to my podcast on your favorite podcast outlet, please do that. It helps carry the message to more people. I started this podcast because there was so much wisdom in recovery that just wasn't making its way out into the world. So I want as many people as possible to hear it. I'd also love it if you'd leave a 5-star rating or a review, which you can do on Apple Podcasts. It helps other people find it so they can get the benefits that you've gotten from listening. If someone in particular came to mind when you listen to this episode, please share it with them. And my favorite place to hang out on social media is Instagram. I'm at Higher Power Coaching. Please DM me there. I'd love to hear what you've got from this episode. I run private and group coaching programs on building healthy boundaries. Whether you need help with boundaries in your personal, professional, or romantic life, I can help. Head on over to barbchat.net where you can get on my calendar for a free 30-minute Better Boundaries consultation. I also do short-term situational coaching to help people make it through specific situations they're going through, such as divorce, empty nesting, preparing for retirement, or any phase where their identity is shifting. Regardless of the type of coaching, my ideal client is someone who is ripe for change. If that's you, I'd love to work with you. My goal with all my work is to help you make lasting changes in your life, like I've made deep, lasting changes in my life. Remember, it's never too late to recover. No one is beyond hope, and healing is possible. Thanks for listening.